So one thing that I thought about when I was watching the most recent Democratic debate was that, besides Bernie Sanders' incredible hand gestures, was just how the staying power of criminal justice as an issue in the race. I mean, it was almost 2 years ago, Eric Garner happened, around the same time Michael Brown, but it's still one of, it's not, if not the top question, it's one of the leading questions that at least the Democratic side has focused on, which I think, given how fickle American politics usually is, I think that's kind of interesting.
I think it is really interesting, but I also think that basically Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton are trying to make their case and explain their differences in criminal justice policy. But now that Rand Paul's been out of the race on the Republican side, the subject has largely been sort of left out of the discussion. And so I do really wonder, when we pivot to the general election, what's going to happen and where criminal justice is going to fall, and whether we're just going to go back to the same sort of tough on crime from the right, we need reform on the left, and whether that sort of agreement that seemed to be there will fall away, or whether it will actually continue.
Right, because so much of the Democratic race has been cast anyway as a fight for African American voters, for whom that's a big issue, and right, that dynamic may well change when we get to the general. Have any of the Republicans said anything about this? I'm trying to think.
I think, well, many of them have in
besides Rand Paul.
In recent years, I think if you go back, I think there was somebody published like a book of essays that various possible candidates wrote in back in like 2014, 2015, where like Rubio and Cruz discussed some like criminal justice issues. But I think the reason it's been so persistent is because it's politically expedient, because the public safety is no longer the number one concern for many more Americans than it was 20, 30 years ago. So people are no longer kind of blinded by fear and can now kind of look at the consequences of the policies from the tough on crime era. So I think this kind of greater, this kind of ambiguous term criminal justice reform is sort of just this, the backlash of us kind of recognizing the negative consequences of the previous era without kind of being, without being blinded by the fear of kind of what the crime rates were back then.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I wonder too if part of it, I mean, one thing Sanders talks about is, the sheer number of people who are, involved in the system. And obviously if you're to tally up cumulatively over the years, it'd be millions and millions of people. I wonder if like enough people now have either been busted or jailed or imprisoned themselves, or know someone who has, that like everyone is sort of touched by it in some way. Because crime's not as big a concern, but the flip side, why is there suddenly this sympathy for people who were considered super predators 20 years ago by Hillary anyway?
I think it's really interesting on the conservative side that a lot of it actually hasn't been driven so much by sympathy, but more of a fiscal responsibility to lower costs. So you don't always see from the conservative side that you're feeling bad for people, really, that it's more like this is just a huge waste of taxpayer dollars. At the same time, on the right, there is a sort of break off of the religious part of the party that feels that this is actually like a human rights crisis. But those two things don't always get put together, in my opinion, when I watch the right. On the left, that's often the discussion is just, that there's too many people involved, there's too many people that don't need to be involved in the criminal justice system. But yeah, once again, the bipartisanship that seemed to be coalescing now when we see the sentencing reform bill and other things kind of dying, you just kind of wonder, does the momentum keep up? And then when you have someone like Trump and Cruz ahead, there's no sympathetic criminal justice elements coming out. This is who can be tougher, really. So it's sort of just harkening back to the 90s when it was all about, are you soft on crime, and that being like just a political death if people.
Right, a scarlet letter. Yeah.
Maybe I'm naive. I feel like I'm optimistic though.
That's good.
And I think the
Full.
and I think part of the reason, I think like at this very moment today, the discourse is being driven by presidential election politics. Mm-hmm. But I think the trajectory is moving forward, and I think the reason is that, like you suggested earlier, criminal justice reform does kind of play into the angels of both conservatives and liberals. For conservatives, the criminal justice system right now is a big government, expensive program that has a lot of like fat that can be trimmed. And for liberals, it's a civil rights issue, and it plays into like the bleeding heart aspects of getting justice for the disenfranchised. And I think once kind of the mess of the campaign season is over, I think it'll pick back up. I think a lot of the current, the Ferguson effect myths and all that, I think over time that will kind of die down as the trends kind of balance back out to what they have been for the past couple of decades. And I think it'll pick up. I think it'll pick up within the next couple of years.